Chapter 1. If I were the Antichrist. Imagine for just a moment, imagine these were the thoughts of the greatest deceiver the world will ever know. If I wanted to deceive the world, I wouldn't begin with fear. Fear makes people cautious. I'd begin with hope. I wouldn't destroy the truth. I'd build a counterfeit so convincing, most people would never notice the difference. I wouldn't arrive as a monster. I'd arrive as the answer to war, the answer to division, the answer to uncertainty, because people rarely choose what they know is evil. They choose what they believe is good. That's why deception has always been my greatest weapon, not because my lies are unbelievable, but because they're almost indistinguishable from the truth. If you're expecting evil to announce itself, you've misunderstood how deception works. The greatest counterfeit never introduces itself as a counterfeit. It asks to be trusted, and once trust is given, almost anything can follow. Now ask yourself one question. Isn't that exactly why Jesus' first warning about the last days was not watch for war, but see that no one leads you astray? Chapter 2. The perfect counterfeit. If I were the Antichrist, I wouldn't ask the world to worship evil. I'd ask the world to redefine it, because no one wakes up in the morning hoping to be deceived. People believe what seems true. They trust what feels familiar. They follow what appears to work. That's why the greatest counterfeit in history could never be obvious. Counterfeit money doesn't fool people because it looks different. It fools people because it looks real. Jesus understood that. He never warned his followers that deception would be easy to recognize. He warned that it would be convincing, so convincing that if it were possible, even the elect would be deceived. Think about that for a moment. Not the careless, not the indifferent, the elect. That single warning should change how we read every prophecy about the last days, because if the final deception is powerful enough to test even faithful believers, then perhaps the greatest danger isn't recognizing evil. Perhaps it's failing to recognize a counterfeit that looks remarkably like the truth. And if that's true, then the question is no longer who is the Antichrist. The question becomes, would I recognize him if everything about him appeared right? Chapter 3. The greatest substitute. If I were the Antichrist, I wouldn't ask the world to abandon Christ. I'd offer them a substitute, because substitutes are always easier to accept than opposites. Throughout history, the most dangerous counterfeits have never declared war on the original. They simply offered something that looked close enough. Most people assume the word Antichrist simply means against Christ. But the ancient Greek invites us to consider something even more unsettling. What if the greatest danger isn't merely opposition, but imitation, a replacement, a counterfeit, something that stands where the real thing belongs? Suddenly, the warnings of Jesus begin to sound different. False Christs, not false monsters. False Christs, not people claiming to fight Christ, but people, movements, or messages claiming to represent him while leading people somewhere else. That's how deception has always worked. Not by removing the truth, but by standing so close to it that only careful discernment reveals the difference. And if the greatest deception is a substitute, then perhaps the most important question isn't who opposes Christ. It's who claims to stand in his place. Chapter 4. The first counterfeit. If I were the Antichrist, I wouldn't invent a new strategy. I'd use one that's been working since the beginning. The first deception in the Bible didn't begin with violence. It began with a question. Did God really say? One question, one small seed of doubt. Notice what the serpent didn't do. He didn't ask Eve to stop believing in God. He didn't tell her to worship Satan. He simply invited her to trust another voice, a voice that sounded reasonable, a voice that promised wisdom, a voice that offered something God had supposedly withheld. The temptation wasn't merely rebellion, it was independence. The promise wasn't destruction, it was enlightenment, and humanity has been believing the same promise ever since. Every counterfeit begins the same way. It doesn't ask us to reject truth overnight. It asks us to improve it, reinterpret it, or replace it with something that feels just a little more appealing. Perhaps that's why the final deception won't feel unfamiliar. Perhaps it will feel like the oldest lie, told one more time. Chapter 5. The question that matters. If I were the Antichrist, I'd hope you spent your entire life searching for me, instead of searching for the truth. I'd let you argue over prophecy, debate timelines, speculate about governments, name politicians, as long as one question never crossed your mind. Whose voice am I following? Because deception doesn't begin the day the Antichrist appears. It begins the moment a lie sounds more appealing than the truth. Jesus never promised his followers they would avoid deception simply because they believed in him. He warned them repeatedly to remain watchful, to test what they heard, and to know his voice. Perhaps that's why his first warning about the last days wasn't fear, it was discernment. For 2,000 years, generation after generation has asked the same question. Who is the Antichrist? Maybe we've been asking the second question first, because before the world can follow the wrong man, it must first learn to trust the wrong voice. And perhaps that's the greatest warning hidden in Scripture. The Antichrist's greatest weapon may never be his power. It may never be his influence. It may simply be that when he finally comes, he doesn't sound like an enemy. He sounds like the answer. So before you leave this documentary, before you search another headline, before you wonder if the Antichrist is alive today, ask yourself one question. If someone stood before me claiming to speak for Christ, would I know the difference? Because if that question is difficult to answer, then perhaps the greatest deception isn't still coming. Perhaps its preparation has been happening all along.